This is, as I said, the second session that covers the recent history on this topic. And tonight we're going to hear from Joanne Hameister as well as Kathy Goldrick. And Joanne has a BS in mathematics and advanced education in statistics, computer technology. She is retired from a 45-year career as a research analyst in various fields of pharmacy, aerospace engineering, operations, and advanced designs. And she was introduced to issues at the West Valley Nuclear Facility through her appointment to the League of Women Voters as the chair of New York State Program Committee, and has also been a member of the Coalition on West Valley Nuclear Waste Steering Committee since 1982. So a good long time of engagement there from Joanne. She continues to serve the coalition and the West Valley Action Network. And also important to note that in 1991, she was tapped by Governor Cuomo to the New York State Low-Level Radioactive Waste Study Group. She has also served on the steering committee that formed the Western New York Land Conservancy and served its board of directors for 10 years. And Joanne is going to open us up with a presentation, and then she will turn it over to Kathy Goldrick, who has lived in the West Valley and Ellicottville area for about 40 years and has been involved with the West Valley Coalition on Nuclear Waste for almost that long. Kathy raised 2 daughters in the area and is retired from administration in the social work field. So thank you to Joanne and Kathy for their time this evening, and to all of you for joining us. We are recording this series to continue capturing this history and action on West Valley. And throughout these presentations, you can add any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll have plenty of time to turn to those following the presentations. So Joanne, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you. I need some help in making sure that I'm sharing the screen here.
Yep, we can see your first slide perfectly.
You can see my first, you can see it, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Because I've got other stuff up on top here. I just want to make sure that I don't know what's going out. Okay. All right. This is sort of explanatory. The West Valley started out as the only commercial fuel reprocessing facility for nuclear fuel from power plants. It only operated for 6 years, and they sort of walked away from their waste, and that had been developed in the process of, chopping up fuel rods, dissolving them in an acid bath, and then leaving that stuff in the big tank. That's still there. Okay, now I'm having trouble getting this to. Okay, there we go. This is the site. It's a couple of 100 acres. There's quite a bit of land there, but we're going to, I'll briefly, there are a lot of buildings. They are in the process of being torn down, but the stuff that's left is what I consider to be the waste that we have to, the risks that we have to deal with. The site is very close to Lake Erie. It's on Buttermilk Creek drains the site in Ashford, and that goes to Cattaraugus Creek, which goes to Lake Erie right around the corner from Sturgeon Point, which is where Erie County gets its water, and then the water crawls down the coast to Buffalo, the Niagara River, and exits in Lake Ontario, and radionuclides with the fingerprint of West Valley have been found in Lake Ontario. That's basically its location is a risk, and I just wanted to show that. This is the actual site that has been dedicated to the facility. It's a couple 100 acres. New York State NYSERDA owns about 3,000 acres, and this is part of it. I like to point out to people that they have this little point here that crawls up Buttermilk Creek to Cattaraugus Creek because New York State has permits about what can leave the site. So they want to make sure that any of the waste from the site here are carefully diluted by Buttermilk Creek before they enter the river and get tested for their appropriateness. I'm not going to give you a lot of lists. I'm going to show you what the risks are, the big ones that I think that we have here. Just reading what's there, and it doesn't show you what happens. But I'm going to just briefly, there are two different major categories of waste: high-level waste based on source, nuclear fuel, that means West Valley, reprocessing, that means West Valley, and transuranics, that means West Valley. But the low-level waste, which is not low risk, has many categories and gets and a lot of different categories that have to be used in the definition. We do have low-level waste at West Valley, and there should be another class in there called WIR, which is waste incidental to reprocessing. We contested that particular reclassification because it was nuclear fuel and reprocessed, but we didn't win that lawsuit. There are basically three types of radiation: the alpha particle, the beta particle, and the gamma rays. The alpha particle is a little bit heavy, a little bit bigger. The beta can be pretty dangerous. Gamma is very dangerous. It's just a ray like X-ray. It can go through most stuff. And these are just some of the radioactive elements that are in the different categories. West Valley has all of them. And this is the what's left there is all of this stuff, and it doesn't mean anything to you. What I'm going to do is show you what the risks look like for some of it. Reprocessing buildings and facilities have, in the last 10 years with the contract CH2BW, they have done a decent job of getting rid of a lot of buildings that are no longer used. The high-level canisters are still there. I will show you that. But I didn't deal with the lagoons in this one. The tanks, burial grounds, and a couple of other problems. And I think the images will stay with you longer than the list will. Starting off, when Nuclear Fuel Services was processing, they would dismantle the fuel assemblies and chop up the fuel rods and then dissolve them in an acid bath. That becomes a witch's brew. And they put the end of that process into a tank, and the tank is huge. I'll show you that in a minute. But the problem with West Valley is that it's much more complicated than the other reprocessing sites, say at Hanford and Savannah River. Those two sites did reprocess fuel rods, but they were weapons-based. They weren't as hot as the ones that we got at West Valley. And they did it for a purpose of producing the uranium and the plutonium. West Valley, we tried the purpose with the commercial fuel rods from power plants was to safely secure the waste. This is what a tank looks like. It's huge. They're huge, 600,000 gallons, huge. And you can see the size of the tank. There's a little man there on the left. And there are 4 tanks there, and I've had trouble trying to coordinate telling what happened, because when the Department of Energy took over in 1982, the tanks were used in different ways, but the main tank, 8D2, is the one that produced 2 streams of waste. One was a supernatant that they managed to extract with by isolating the positive ions of uranium and plutonium and other stuff with ion exchange columns, and left excuse me, and we're left with a rather thin radioactive material. But they put that waste into 19,072 gallons tanks and shipped them off-site. The total in those 19,000 gallons is minuscule, but by the same token, those tanks are heavy, and this speaks to what is required to secure and monitor nuclear waste, even 4,000 curies. A curie, by the way, is 97 billion disintegrations per second. That means every time you see a curie, that's a pretty hot little item, a little measurement. And then the second stream was they built a melter to take the high level stuff, the uranium and cesium and strontium and other ions that were left over after they took the supernatant out of the tanks, and mixed it with borosilicate glass and melted it, and then poured it into stainless steel containers. They're 2.5 feet wide and 10 feet tall, and each one has a lot of curies in it. They only ended up producing 275 of those canisters. They put 5 of them into a cask. This was recently, in recent history, in a cask, and filled the cask with grout concrete. And there they are. They ended up with 276 of these, 55 drums, cask drums. This is what it looks like. 200 feet from Rock Springs Road. Those are very hot. That's a very hot area right there. Each canister holds about 87,000 curies. That's a lot of risk. And I think the fact that this is the way it looks right now, these casks are right out in the open. This is Rock Springs Road here at the bottom. And the equipment they had to use, the melter, was built. They actually had to build a building called the vitrification building. And these were 3 pieces of the equipment. They are now off-site, but I love showing you this picture. This is what they had to move it in. This is an entire truck. And I would love to have the tire contract for this piece of this rig. It's a monster. Here's the melter. That's the only piece they moved. Each trip to the train depot in Blaisdell required this rig to move each piece individually. This is a cost of dealing with nuclear waste. It amazes me. It amazes me. And these are all the areas that are of concern. And the government accounting office is getting involved more. We're getting some, they realize that we really have to get into a good decision process. They have been at it now for 40 years. The plant only operated for 6, and we're 40 years into dealing with what they left behind. And you can see where the canister pad is relative to, here's the processing site where all the buildings were and that kind of thing. Over here is one of the burial grounds, and I'll get to that in a minute. So this whole thing is a lot of money has gone into it already. They've spent over $3 billion cleaning up. That, you know, and then there were these. It's called the strontium plume. There was a leak under the main process building that has leaked into the groundwater, and they didn't discover it right away. And it has spread underground and is obviously contaminating the soil. And we don't know how deep, but it's quite long. And Shannon Seneca designed this permeable treatment wall, this black line here in the strontium plume, to intercept it. And it's quite, well, you can see it's 800 feet long. It's quite a big trench, and filled it with a special zeolite to absorb the strontium as it moved through on the groundwater. And I asked them at the hearing what they would do when the zeolite was full, and they said they would dig it up as I had dug this big trench to put it into, and treat that as low-level waste also. So, you know, and then they'd put more zeolite in to stop this leak. That sounds like a lot of work for a mistake. You know, they spilled it in the building, and then we're dealing with it, and it's just spreading. And then there are the burial grounds. These are going to be a problem. The state had started theirs before Nuclear Fuel Services started their business, and they're just plain dug trenches, and eventually they were closed because they filled up with water. There's quite a bit of waste in there. And then the federal government has one that basically they're holes, so they put tanks and stuff in it. But the one of the things that I thought was interesting, they were moving one of the dissolver tanks from their operations to bury it because it was hot, it was radioactive. And it started leaking on the trailer they were moving it to. And they had to bury not only the dissolver, but the flatbed trailer that was carrying it. And then they had to dig up the highway, the road surface that had been dripped on from the, so it was one mistake after another. But here again, we're talking about a lot of curies at 37 billion per. And this is how they made the trenches. This is how they dug unlined, unengineered, plain clay soil. And this is how they filled it. This is risky. And then a couple of years ago, they did cover it with a geotextile. That's a 15-acre piece of cloth, by the way, that they had to put on top of that to seal it, to keep the rainwater and the melting snow out. Its location, however, is risky. Plus, I think if they leave it there, they'll have to keep people to monitor it, make sure that it stays safe, and that the waste in there is going to be viable for thousands of years. Now I love this picture here. Yeah, this shows the plateau where the plant is, and it's just riddled with creeks. And if EPA, if NEPA, if the National Environmental Policy Act had been passed when NFS started, I don't think they would have chosen this site, primarily because of all the creeks and the gullies. And the eroding creeks have actually formed a plateau, so it's elevated, which means that it's still in the process of being changed by the eroding creeks. So that, and there we are. That's another risk that we really don't have an easy solution for. And this is just another. This one shows the burial grounds right here, and then this is sort of a 3D. This is better, I think. It shows a three-dimensional aspect with the elevation, and here's the creek bed. Look at this. That's the gully that's forming here, and that I think this is a spot that had a landslide and moved the creek 15 feet closer to the burial grounds. Dr. Wilson at Fredonia did this schematic. He was a geologist, and he did this schematic to show the advance of the erosion. And this was a landslide that happened with the 5-inch rainstorm we had in 2009. That's the one that moved back 15 feet. That's pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive. Excuse me. One of the problems we've had just in dealing with documents at West Valley and information and the lack of transparency. The left picture here is what they first came out with in 1996 with the estimation of the erosion impact. And then they decided not to continue with that draft environmental impact. And the next one showed this kind of a change in their prediction. It's just a question of, who do you believe? And, how do we know? We do have climate change coming around, and that 5-inch rainstorm was most unusual for the area. So we have to question some of this prediction. And then this is an interesting one. This with that 5-inch rainstorm, the Cattaraugus Creek flows into Lake Erie, and it developed turbidity areas here with, and this shows the plumes of water, and also the Niagara River pluming up here. But the water stays pretty close to the shore when it enters Lake Erie, and right around the corner is Sturgeon Point, where Erie County gets its water for all its residents, and not too far down the coast is the Buffalo water intake. So all of Western New York could be subject to renegade radioactivity leaving the site. This is my favorite picture. I'm actually thinking of having it printed and framed. This is the plume at Lake Ontario. And what I love about this, it's a fairly deep lake, but the water doesn't go to the bottom. Here's the Niagara River, and it just rotates and plumes around and heads towards Rochester, which was where I was raised. So those are the risks. And then here's just the risks of erosion. Anything can happen. We've already had gully advances. We've had landslides. We've let's see, I found another one here. We're concerned. Oh, we've got certainly contamination of the soils, and bathtubbing we've had. I'm sorry, there's another one here. I'm having trouble reading it myself. But we've had a lot of these conditions at West Valley. They're all risks. And the coalition started actually in 1974, before the Department of Energy was formed. And so we've got a longer history than the Department of Energy. Even NYSERDA, we were formed before before any government agencies, really, for something as private as this. And we had to petition the Atomic Energy Commission. That's how far along we were, to how far back we were, to gain access to decisions that were to be made at West Valley on behalf of nuclear fuel services. So we've had a long history with the site. Eventually, after NFS walked away, the government did form the West Valley Demonstration Project Act. And as far as I know, we're the only waste site that has its own act of Congress, which is interesting. And then we've had a number of EISs and environmental a lot of environmental stuff that has to be decision based. And then they get into down here, the full cost accounting study. The coalition actually got the funding for that through Senator Young. And so that we managed to do that. And it was done by Synapse. It was a well-done study. We like to draw on it. Anyway, where we are is right here with a supplemental environmental impact, and we're having trouble again getting good information. It's gonna have a couple of parts to it that will not be transparent in time for comment from the public. I think this is a scheduling problem that we have with what's going on there. And this is where we are. This is actually the third EIS that we're dealing with. And the pandemic has pushed some of this. I think the decisions won't be made in 10 years. That was last year. They won't be made in 10 years. The SCIS has to be done first, and that won't be released for another couple of years, I think 2023. The coalition has had some successes, and we did sue and won. If you can imagine a little group of citizens suing the United States of America and the Department of Energy, it was a tough decision to make, but we won, and we got the stipulation of compromise, which has given us a leg up. We don't have to file FOIAs for our questions and things like that. We have quarterly public meetings, and every 3 months the public is invited to, and DOE and NYSERDA have to conduct them. So we've had some successes. Our goal has always been, we wanted to make sure that good decisions were made at West Valley. That has been our total mission. There have been some problems. There was a filter blowout, which spread all the way to Springville. The strontium plume, which I dealt with a little bit. And then they started noticing there was strange odors coming out of an area where there are a couple of tanks of plutonium-laden kerosene, and that they were leaking. This shows you how badly they thought about burying things, because the tanks, when they dug them up, the tanks were sealed with duct tape, and they had to excavate some of the soil, but what they recovered, as far as the plutonium went, was not nearly as much as supposedly had been buried there. So there's a suspicion that there's a lot of plutonium in the soil around that area. We've had excursions to the creeks and the lakes. I mentioned the Indian reservation is at the mouth of the Cattaraugus Creek, and they do have more monitoring. They do some of it themselves, so because there are risks there. And the apple orchard. When we had the 5-inch rainstorm, we asked for a tour, and they couldn't give it to us for 10 days because they were busy dealing with the creek erosion and trying to patch it up. And when we got out of the car, I got out of the van near the NDA, the federal burial ground. Off to the side was all this yellow tape around some trees, and I asked that there were 4 industries.
Let's see, is it just me, folks, or have we lost Joanne's video?
But these workers, these people who were there all the time, had never questioned it. And that surprised me. And they felt that the apple trees were drawing on the contamination from the federal burial grounds. The canisters were set to go to Yucca Mountain as the only high-level waste site, but that got closed down. So now We have no place to send the high-level waste in those canisters. So that's why we have the pad on site. That's another risk. And interestingly, when they were digging the pad, the concrete pad, they found contamination that far away. They did vitrify, they did melt the high-level waste and vitrify it and secure it in a solid form. They did ship the 20,000 drum cells off to Nevada. They exhumed the holes in the NDA where the plutonium was leaking. The new contractor, CH2, has done a good job of getting rid of a lot of buildings. The vitrification building was taken down recently, and that was contaminated, and they did that successfully. What we have coming up right now is doing the main process building, and that is a very hot building. I think that it's going to take several years. A lot of little cells inside that are contaminated, cells meaning little lab cells that are contaminated. They had collected some fuel assemblies, which they returned, so that they are gone. And where we are, we have a lot of radioactive sites. I didn't cover them all. There's lagoons, there's a lot of radioactive soil from leaks. The decommissioning plan has a chart of spills that occurred during NFS's period there. It's 3 pages long. So the soil around there is very contaminated. They do have a lot of monitoring wells, but think about it, the monitoring wells are only a couple inches wide and go down and you know, there's spaced too far apart to really do a good a good inventory of what's in the ground. So I've always worried about what we leave for the future, because we could lose institutional control down there and people will just sort of stumble onto it. And I think we've got to make sure that the place is clean. This is all the problems that this is a depressing one. It just shows where all the problems are, and it's not something I'm going to hang on my wall, you know. And as I say, the coalition is still in business, and there's a need for us. I've spent over half of my life with them, and that's Kathy, it's on to you.
Hi, I'm Kathy McGoldrick. It's McGoldrick. I've been involved with the coalition for about 40 years as well, as I said, and all I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about some actions that, as the public or the media, you might want to take. I want to back up just a little bit and talk about some of the decision making at West Valley. In 2010, there was another impact statement, and it really didn't make a decision. What it did was it was a split decision, and it said there will be 2 phases, and in phase 1, what we will do is we will sort of clean up some of the things Joanne talked about, sort of topical cleaning, I guess. I'm very important, and they have done a wonderful job, but they did things like in phase 1, main plant process building, which I'll talk about in a minute, the waste facility, the vitrification facility, lagoons, various other things. But phase 2 is then the decision-making part. So the idea was phase one would be a cleanup, and phase two will be, and in phase one, they will start to do the studies and the work required to make the kinds of decisions that will come out in the supplemental environmental impact statement in phase two, which will be 22, 23. We're not really sure at this point because, as Joanne said, a lot of the work has been kind of slowed down by COVID. So right now we're in phase one, and Joanne alluded to this as well. One of the critical issues that you can kind of grab onto right now is that in probably fall, late summer, early fall, we're told, they will be demolishing the main plant process building, which is, as Joanne said, the hottest building on the site. We have asked, local communities have asked for this facility to be covered when they demolish it so that we can ascertain that there is no airborne radioactivity. And although some buildings, Department of Energy buildings, have been covered, we've been told that they don't intend to cover this building because buildings that have been covered have primarily been in areas where a lot of people are working. And so to be absolutely sure that local people working right there near the demolition site would not be affected, they covered those buildings. We continue to ask for a cover on this building. Probably it's a matter of cost, but this is an important issue. The Seneca Nation is right downstream. There are a lot of people within wind distance of the site. We are told, to be fair, that they will be monitoring wind velocity very closely and that they will stop work at certain wind velocities or if they're projected. However, we feel strongly about this. And the other thing that you can ask for, this is real-time air monitoring offsite. All of the monitoring, as far as I'm aware, that they intend to do, at least all real-time monitoring that they intend to do, is on the site. We have asked that they put these monitors in other places around the site, and we really haven't gotten anywhere with that. So that's another thing to ask for. And we would like that monitoring before they start the demolition, during the demolition, and then after the demolition, just to look at the continuum of air quality during those times. So that's one thing you can do. And I have put some links there, a link there for you. It's the Nuclear Research NERS website, and they have sort of one of those stock, they will help you get to the governor, the lieutenant governor, and your local state representatives to talk about some of these things. One of the other things that we have asked people to do, though, if you're going to be talking to these people, it's great to remind them that the cleanup right now during phase one is not the end of this. We're looking at studies being done now for phase two, which will be the decision making for how the place, how West Valley actually ends up for eternity, basically. We have a problem right now, and Joanne alluded to this as well. In 2022 or 23, whenever the supplemental environment impact statement is given to the public, they will be talking about how decisions on how to leave the site for perpetuity. And a big part of that determination is based on a probability assessment. That's because they really looking at what might happen to the site in the future, hundreds of thousands of years from now, as well as the day after the place is closed down. So we're talking about lots of things that could happen. So what they need to do is an analysis, basically, of the probability of certain things that could happen or not happen in the future. And then I'm putting this in real layman's terms, so pardon me for being very simplistic, they'll take part of this whole final decision-making process is taking that probability, those probabilities, and combining it with cost, what they feel, the Department of Energy and NYSERDA, the state feel is probably safe by their estimation and cost effective. We're really afraid, given that scenario, that we're going to end up with stuff left in the ground. And because this probability performance assessment is so important in terms of their decision, we're really concerned. And I'll tell you why. At the beginning of this process, when they contracted with a company called Neptune, we were told that we would have information as to what was going into this assessment from the very beginning, or pretty close to it. So we would know what kind of data was going into the assessment, because it's, as people say, poo-poo in, poo-poo out. And when you talk about doing assessments and you're looking at these kind of logistics and statistics and everything else, we were concerned. We were told we would have like a virtual library that we'd be able to take a look at to see what kinds of data was going in, and what kinds of formulas they were using, basically, because there are many kinds of formulas, and I certainly am not an expert in that. It might be something we talk about in the future. Assumptions made in the PPA may or may not be true, and that's why we felt it very important to know what was going into this probability performance assessment. What they told us is that we would be seeing that. Now we're being told we will not get that information until we get the supplemental environmental impacts study. And that's too late. I mean, by then the damage is done, if there's damage. They have developed the formulas without any input from the public or other professionals in the field. And there really will not be anything we can do about it. So that is another thing to talk about. It's kind of a complicated thing to talk about, but there's lots of us here. If you want to write a letter, you want to talk to officials, we're happy to help you out with that. We're concerned, and we're especially concerned about how climate crisis may or may not be incorporated into this probability performance assessment. To many of us, that's the most critical part of this. There are lots of other issues, but I just want to pick that one out because it's easiest to understand, I think. And Joanne talked a little bit about erosion. Erosion of the site might be exacerbated by extreme weather events, and like the one we had, as Joanne talked about, I think was it 2009, when Gowanda, which is not far from the site, we lost a whole emergency room at the hospital. We lost lots of things in Gowanda, and I think some people lost their lives. That was just one episode. Are they considering more major weather events in this probability performance assessment? If so, how? Another example, if we had drought and it wasn't flood and the ground was severely dry and impermeable, and there was one of these major rains, would then water run right off and create more of a flooding situation with the runoff from that kind of weather event as well? Just the parchment, the parching of the soil. These are the kinds. That's just a couple of little examples, and I'm trying, to give to you to explain why we're concerned about what is going into this assessment and why we feel now that we're being blocked from getting information we were told we would be able to have. So if the right decision's not made, and Joanne talked about this, and we end up with some of this stuff left in the ground, for example, it will, as Joanne said, I'm not going to repeat hers, end up in the Great Lakes. So finally, the decision we're making and talking about is Yeah, cost is involved, but I guess another question you can ask local officials is, have they considered the cost of what would happen to public health? How much public health would cost if radiation went into the Great Lakes? Also, the cost of the potential to lose a lot of tourism dollars on the lake. Even a bad reputation with some leakage is going to hurt, financially. These are things that public officials respond to, and so, don't be afraid to talk about them. Yeah, so my little slide here, I think feel free to contact any of us as well. If you don't want to use the NEARS website, I think all of us are willing to help you, to have a conversation with you about what you can do. And join us for the quarterly public meetings. They are once a month. They have been virtual lately, but I think we're looking at them possibly going back to being live. If they are live, they're in Ashford, which is right down 219, basically. It's not at the site, so you don't need to worry about that. And also, I'm on the Citizens Task Force as well. I didn't put that in my bio, but that is the sort of, I guess you could call it kind of watchdog. It's not really, it's a group of local people, and there's someone on it from Roswell. There's many different people of many different vocations from various localities in the area in Western New York. And although you cannot, generally speaking, in the Citizens Task Force meetings, you can't ask questions as presentations are given unless you're on the task force. You can listen, and generally there's time left at the end where citizens and media or whoever can ask questions of the presenters. So those are very educational. You might feel like you're a fish out of water when you first start going, because most of the people there have been there before, but stick with it. It doesn't take long to really get the gist of what's being said. Yeah, so I guess that's about it. I think there's room for questions. I didn't want to overwhelm anybody with the logistics and the of planning and things that are going on, but I'm happy to answer or try to answer any questions. I'm sure Joanne is too. Thanks.
Very good. Well, thank you so much again, Joanne and Kathy, for those presentations and continuing this series. We've had one question from Rich Newberg, who I see has unmuted. So Rich, I'll let you just jump in yourself.
Oh, well, I had a question written, but I just wanted to ask how long you think the demolition will go once it begins. What's entailed in taking that building down? And a second question, I guess, would be, have the networks been advised about this? 60 Minutes and some of those magazine programs that can really shed some light on this. Love Canal in its time attracted tremendous amount of publicity. And I wonder if that same can happen here, if people understand the risks that are involved.
Joanne, do you?
Well, yeah, I'll try. It's when you mention Love Canal, I live halfway between Love Canal and West Valley, and I was in the League of Women Voters. I spent half of my time at Love Canal and half of it at West Valley, so I know what you're talking about. Yes, I don't think we have. Rich, that's a tough one. I don't, West Valley is a very small site. It's a very small site. And compared to other nuclear sites, it's really, small potatoes.
But are the risks as great? Are the risks as great in some of these other bigger sites? I mean, if the water system for the Northeast goes, that's pretty big risk. The Great Lakes.
Yes, that I think is the biggest risk that would spread right. I mean, you really don't want to throw this stuff into the Great Lakes, even though we're the last two on the line. I worry more about that. Plus, I worry about the fact if it does get into our water supply, it's going to be distributed through the whole water intake septic system. If there's a fire, it's going to be vaporized into the air, just using the water to put out a fire. The spread of that kind of contamination, the potential for it is huge, because we're a densely populated area too. Hanford has had a lot of problems, but they're so isolated. I mean, they've got thousands upon thousands of acres, and nobody lives around them. But we're only 30, West Valley's only 30 miles from Buffalo, and it's closer to Orchard Park and East Aurora, where I live. So, the risk is there. Plus,
Rich, excuse me, maybe that's something, Rich, maybe that's something you could help us with. I think your point is well taken, and more so now, because it was interesting when they did the scoping comments for the supplemental environmental impact statement, how many people came back with the comment that there are many people that feel like our region, the Great Lakes region, may become a kind of climate refuge in the future because of the water supply, because we don't have some of the tornadoes and hurricanes and major weather events of other places that we might possibly, I mean, we can't take the risk of contaminating these lakes. I mean, it might be it is, and it will may become more of a refuge for people in the future in terms of climate. I think your point's well taken, and we can use any help from you and other people in the media that we can get to make some of those contacts nationally. That would be wonderful.
Well, I know Diane DeRigo's done a great job getting at least 2 out of the 3 stations in Buffalo involved.
Yes.
And, they're starting to pay closer attention, and that's a natural feed sometimes into the networks. But I know with Love Canal, the human tragedy is what attracted the media and attracted, eventually President Carter coming here. And do we have any evidence that this has already taken a human toll on some of the workers, for example, who work there? Because the New York Times had that article. There was sloppiness in the way things were carried out, and people were trudging this stuff into their homes. They weren't changing their boots. I mean, but do we know? You mentioned apples and apple orchard. Do we know that these events are happening, or do we have any long-term effects on the health of people?
Carol Mongerson, who started the coalition, and I went to Johns Hopkins to talk to an epidemiologist about the possibility of doing a health study. Dr. Matinowski gave us a whole day. I was so pleased because Carol and I had a lot of questions. One of the things that Dr. Matinowski felt was that we didn't have the population density around the site. It would be an epidemiologist's nightmare to try to make sense of it. Plus the fact that with just the process people have today of moving away and moving to different places and just spreading themselves out, the latency period for nuclear effects is very long. And you could live in 3 or 4 different places and be exposed to 3 or 4 other hazards. And so it would be hard to connect the dots in that case. And it was sort of discouraging, but I could understand where Dr. Matinowski was coming from. So we we sort of decided that going after a health study was not worth our time. We wanted to make sure instead that we made good decisions at West Valley so we wouldn't have to do a health study. We cannot leave the stuff there. We simply cannot leave the stuff there. It's too long-lived. It's too
And
long-lived.
a couple of responses to that also in the chat. So folks should make sure you're looking at that. Our friend Linda Schneekloth from the Western New York Environmental Alliance says there has been a huge impact on the Seneca Nation, but without systemic recording or analysis. So again, maybe it's been difficult to track that impact. And then Christine Zinni asks similarly, what about the TV spot on the impact on workers in the site? So maybe if the surrounding population is sparse or hard to document, what about documents on impacts of workers, as Rich mentioned as well? So that's another one to be looking into and keeping in mind. Other comments in the chat have been on Patricia Townsend weighing in on how long the demolition will take. It's not going to be a matter of one action at once. It's going to take probably 3 years. And then a couple more questions here too, but anything else, Joanne or Kathy, on those health impacts to weigh in on, or other points so far?
There's been a little bit of discussion lately on asking for a health study, especially with people at the Seneca Nation. It's in its infancy, but I just wanted to point that out. We recognize that's a real need.
Very good. And then Linda Schneekloth. Oh, sorry, Joanne.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, and Dee's comment just reminded me of that. Before my husband died, we met with, I think it was 13 people from West Valley, all of whom who worked there, who worked at the plant. And they had cancer or other health problems, and they were having trouble getting the compensation, which I thought was interesting. That that this was after that Compensation Act was made, and Dave Piles didn't know about it either, and he had worked there a long time ago. He lives now in New Hampshire, but it's interesting that they had so much trouble getting compensation. What had happened with one of them is that NFS had conveniently lost his dosimeter readings and his monitor. How interesting that something like that might happen. It could happen, but in this case it did, and he was running into a lot of. He had to hire a couple of attorneys to get the compensation that the federal government wanted to pay these workers. So I think the worker situation is bigger than the population at this point. I don't know that for sure. It's just a feeling, because they weren't as protected at one point, and the latency period is long. They could have worked there, and 20 years after they leave, they could develop a cancer or some other serious health effect. That's all I want to say on that one.
Very good. And then some big questions from Linda Schneekloth again. How do you sustain this work as it's so detailed and so critical? And that's actually something I thought, Kathy, your slide on actions to take is so helpful, because this involves so many levels of government. And in our work at Partnership for the Public Good, that's often the first question we look at with partners. Who holds power over the issue you're trying to influence? Sometimes that's very straightforward. You have a lot of actors involved in this. So how is it possible, Linda's saying, to have an impact given the complexity of nuclear waste matters? So big questions.
Well, I think that there are various issues and various levels of government that you go to deal with those specific issues. When we were looking at trying to create interest or to educate people about the demolition of the main plant process building and some of the risks we thought might be inherent in that, we wrote letters to everyone from mayors, the mayor of Buffalo, the Common Council, Erie County, Cattaraugus County, Chautauqua County, to all of the mayors and supervisors and legislatures, because it was a matter of sort of just trying to get enough interest to get people to call the agencies to say, why are you not doing this? But then there are other things, that require federal intervention or work, and there's state. So it just really depends on what specific thing we're trying to do at any point.
Can I ask if you had, let's just say, the best of all worlds, and you had a network come in and say, what are your main issues? What do you want the American people to know right now? And two things. Number one, who would lead that charge from this group? And then what would you tell in a nutshell, because you have to present this in a nutshell to get somebody's interest. But what would you say, how would you sell it?
I think that, again, there are several levels of that as well. I think number one, it goes from microcosm to macrocosm, doesn't it? I mean, we talk about what's there, what happened, about the history, and talk about then it, depending on the timing, this main plant, process building, demolition, and the possible potential risks, but also talk about the long-term risk of this stuff going into the Great Lakes, and talk about how many people that could affect, and with the fact that none of this is included in the cost of nuclear power. Waste is never included in how much nuclear power costs, as it hasn't been in probably the oil and gas industry as well. But you know what? Now that people are fighting solar and they're fighting alternative energy, you always see as one of the arguments how much it's going to cost if somebody walks away from a windmill or somebody walks away from solar panels, how much those panels cost. Suddenly, cost of waste is very important when it comes to alternate energy. And I think that's another point that needs to be made at the end of this story. We should always be considering the cost of the waste of any process. So I think as I said, Rich, I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, you did. And I think this is worthy of national attention. And all you need really is one 60-minute piece to get involvement here and put this on the national radar. How close are you to demolition, would you say?
They're talking about late summer, early fall. Am I right about that, Ray, Joanne? I think that's what we've heard so far.
Yeah. And if I could say, the time alone too, as you underscored, 6 years, the plant was open for what, 6 years? That's been 40 years. The folks have been trying to find a solution, different agencies. That alone is, story, the money involved in that, the duration,
Excellent point.
Yeah, 3 billion. 3 billion is the figure you're using now, right? Right, Joanne? 3 billion, and with a projection of what, 10 billion when it's all said and done, or? Whoop, I think you're muted.
Joanne's you're muted, Joanne.
Joanne, you're muted.
Rich, those figures are correct that you mentioned.
Okay.
I'm sure we'll get Joanne back there, but more good discussion in the chat too for folks to check out, some suggestion on messaging there. And also, again, Diane emphasizing the importance of state level electeds and state level action as well. Joanne, I think we've got you back now.
Yeah,
Diane,
yes.
please.
Yeah.
The estimate is 10 billion. In 1996, the Department of Energy estimated 10 billion for the full cleanup of the site. And that hasn't really been reassessed since.
I brought this to the attention of my class, many of my classes, and what struck, students there too was that it's not just a local story, yes, Buffalo, but we're talking about this reaching, up into Lake Ontario, Rochester, where, near close to where I teach, and whole of the Great Lakes. So, it's a regional story, and in terms of waterways and air pollution, it really does warrant a lot of attention. And I hope that Rich will be able to, find that network and speak to someone about this, so that it gets the deserving, the attention. I know you've done great work on this. I mean, and it's 40 years, still going on, and it's at a crucial tipping point now with the demolition of this building. It just has really struck and shocked everybody, I've told about, from, younger generations too. It's like, I never knew about this. I never heard about this. This was in around Rochester, and some of the students were from Buffalo, So I know you are all doing great work. I'm just seeing, that media being a key here, really, that network connection somehow, some way. Again, a recent connect, or a documentary like Josh Fox's. It's so, to pull it together visually, as you have been doing, but with interviews as well, along the way. Yeah.
I don't want to plug, I'm very sensitive about plugging anything, especially my own stuff, but I do have an initiative to get this into the schools. And it's an overview that takes the whole 40 years into consideration and walks you through it in about 15 minutes, which is about, I guess, the time, the amount of time that a kid could absorb something today in a classroom. But that's what I will send. I will reach out maybe to CBS, my network, the one I'm comfortable with, and I'll put it out there. And I just need to know, who follows up, or who should I talk to after this? Because you need a plan of attack. You just can't send them something and not have a plan of action. And you would take it from there. I mean, I'm out of the news business. I'm out of the on-camera TV news business right now.
We've got Dee's information. That's probably the easiest thing to do at this point. We're a loose coalition of various organizations, and we meet about every 2 weeks. So
yeah, Dee has been great reaching out and there's no reason why this can't be done on a network level and really understand some of the issues here.
So Rich,
it's not going to go away.
Depending which angle we is going to be covered, there are dozens of groups that are part of the West Valley Action Network, and there are about maybe 10 or so of us that meet regularly, some that have more technical expertise, some that have more political savvy, some that have, we've got people that look at different pieces of it. So depending what part of it we're going to emphasize, we've got people that can talk to that.
And the Seneca Nation's been really involved with that. And it's important. They're a big part of this story. So
yeah, that's one, I have to say, is one neglected part throughout the 40 years that I'm familiar with coverage. We never really paid enough attention to the Seneca Nation. And that goes for a lot of social issues, Maybe times are going to change finally.
The West Valley site is a violation of the United Nations Directive on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. You're supposed to have before you take an action, informed consent. And that did not happen at West Valley. That radioactive water goes through their nation. It went through when it was really hot, and no one was notified. So, and now people are going to be downwind of the demolition. Unless we have monitoring, we're never going to know whether radioactivity is spreading, because you can't see, smell, or taste it.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Aggie Williams has really been a great spokesperson too. I mean, the friend from the Seneca Nation, very articulate and also, giving that perspective of what that means. That's how I came to, really learn more about the story. That's how I introduce it, in classes having to do with Indigenous studies. Yeah.
What
So,
grade level are your
Aggie-
kids, Francine? Sorry, Christine, what grade level are your kids?
College.
Oh, they're college age.
Yeah, I keep
What's
saying
their what's their reaction when they learn the reality of some of this stuff?
Well, we talk about environmental issues and impact in the class altogether from on different native in and around different native nations. As Aggie has pointed out so many times, Aggie Williams said it again, native nations are often, the territories are used as national sacrifice areas. I think she talked about that in the last session too, we had here. And the fact that this nuclear site is so close, shocks them. We've talked about, the pipeline, different things in the class, but then bringing it home to, the Buffalo region and that this is so very close, it's disbelief. They've done presentations on it, looking at some of your PowerPoints that you've shared, some of the people here, and information over the years. And yeah, it's really an eye opener. So the word is spread that way, by word of mouth. But I really think, again, media would make a huge difference, documentary style. I work in video myself, as some people know. So yeah, I'm a great advocate, but it does make a difference, especially if you want to reach different, groups, different types of groups. Picture 1,000 words, like you said, Joanne too, bringing in those images of the casts and tanks, and oh gosh, it's so disgusting, it really is, that this should continue on like this way.
One of the other things I wanted to point out, and it's interesting, when they do these impact studies, often, and again, this is all in very simplistic form, because that's the way I have it in my mind. They always look at a guy coming on site and like starting a farm as being the biggest risk, the most potential, the worst thing that could happen. Well, in this particular case, if you really want to study the significance or the impact of a catastrophe, it's not a farmer building a farm on the site, it's the people, downstream of this place, which is, millions of people and the Great Lakes. But it's just the way it's measured in the impact studies. And that is, personally, to me, something I think needs to be changed in terms of the way we look at these environmental impact studies. Just the whole scope of what's the biggest risk.
Well, I know early on, before the plume and a lot of these other things, the immediate, we saw deer grazing on the low level site, and you had cows, cow's milk, and dairy farms, and Mr. Zimmerman, right?
Yes.
Amel. I mean,
Amos.
yeah, and he was pretty articulate, and you're always looking for a human element, a human connection to get the word out. Otherwise, it's scientific, and a lot of people just won't take the time. But when they see somebody whose livelihood is at stake or whose health is immediately at stake, that's what resonates. And that's why we went after, in the early days, the people who lived or farmed in that area. But now you're talking about, 40 years later and what can happen to everybody who relies on that water system.
Exactly.
Exactly. The watershed and the erosion, and compounded by climate change, as you were saying. I mean, yeah.
So I want to bring us back, as we have just a couple minutes left, and see if Joanne and Kathy have any final word they want to give on on today's theme and really value all the discussion that just happened. Love that the workshop is kind of turning into a strategy session and turning toward action. And before I give Joanne and Kathy today's final words, just a reminder to all that we are doing a monthly series with the network. And so we have the registration up for the next 2 events, and I've put that into the chat. You can register directly at those links to receive the Zoom link by email and then read a little description of what's coming up in the next 2 sessions. The July session importantly digs into the protections needed during the demolition, which we started to learn about a little bit this evening.
Yeah.
So Joanne and Kathy, any closing word for us?
I have only one. It's just the place has risks, and we've got to be aware of them. We have got to be aware of them. I'm getting tired of West Valley, to be honest with you. I just really am getting tired, and I would like to see some good decision making coming down the pike. I would like to make sure that we don't leave the stuff there for future generations. I don't think I'll see that. I don't think I'll, I don't know what will happen, but I doubt very much that they'll make that decision. And unfortunately, I think other people are going to have to carry that flag on for me, and I hope they do, Okay, Kathy, your turn.
And I'm thrilled that there are people like Christine and Rich, what you're doing with the schools. It's wonderful. It's so important for young people to know about this. If in the long term, theoretically, there will be institutional control, but we know how well institutional control went over the last several years and how quickly institutional control can erode. And if
Yeah.
that's not a lesson to us, that we have to leave a legacy of education about this place. Nothing is. So thank you for the work you're doing. We appreciate it.
So thank you all again for joining. Thanks to tonight's speakers, Joanne and Kathy. And really, as a newcomer to the issue, just thanks to all of you on here who have decades together, centuries working to address this and really important work. And we look forward to our July session and some more strategizing in the meantime. And we'll be posting this recording too, so you'll be able to share it.
Thank you so much for your work. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Really good.
Thanks for this
You've
opportunity.
really kept at it, and that's what it takes.